NCJFCJ, for hosting this webinar for us. As always, it has been great working with you on getting this webinar organized. And I'd like to welcome everyone participating on the webinar today, and thank you for joining us. I hope you're having a good day wherever you are, and that for some of you in some parts of the country, you are staying warm. I am calling in from not so sunny Boulder, Colorado, but where our weather is much nicer than it is in the Midwest and on the East Coast. As Alicia mentioned, my name is Bonnie Brandl. I'm the director of the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life. Just a little bit about me. I started working in the field back in the 1990s, volunteering at a rape crisis center and working in several domestic violence programs. In the early 1990s, I joined End Domestic Abuse Wisconsin, which is our statewide membership organization for domestic violence programs. And one of the first projects that I took on was working on a project taking a look at some interviews that older victims had done about what their needs and services were to start to build some infrastructure within the state of Wisconsin. And as a result of that, I spent the 1990s really working at the intersection of domestic violence, sexual assault, and elder abuse, and founded the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life in 1999. The National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life is a proud technical assistance provider for the Office on Violence Against Women as a resource center on abuse in later life, and we're also a TA provider working with the OVW Abuse in Later Life grantees throughout the country. I am thrilled today to be here with my good friend and colleague, Reverend Anne Marie Hunter. And Anne Marie, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thank you. And Bonnie, I'm equally honored to be here with you. So I have been standing at the intersection of faith and abuse and trying to figure it out since about 1985. I'm a United Methodist pastor, and I founded Safe Havens in 1991. I've also worked in a couple of domestic violence shelter agencies and service agencies, one in Massachusetts and one in New Jersey. I've done about 25 years of work with Safe Havens on this intersection of faith and abuse. We too are a national TA provider for the Office on Violence Against Women since 2003. And I began working with Bonnie on abuse in later life in about 2008. So that has been quite a journey. Everything from I think I taught the very first class in a seminary on abuse in later life and faith a couple of years ago. And then last month I presented at the annual conference of the American Academy of Religion on elder abuse and Hebrew scripture. So I feel like our collaborative work is always pushing the envelope as we reach to push the conversation forward.
Yes, I totally agree, Anne-Marie. It has been such a privilege to work with you, and I have learned so much over the years about the intersection of abuse in later life and faith and its important role and tangible, practical ideas for local service providers on how victim service providers and faith leaders can work more effectively together and address the needs of this population. So before we jump into talking about why we think this work is so crucial on the local level, we wanted to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about why we do this work, because we thought it might resonate with some of you in terms of the things that drew us to this work may draw you there as well. And for me, there were really sort of three things that drew me to a project on faith and abuse in later life. As I mentioned, when I started at End Abuse 25 years ago, one of the first projects I had was looking at some interviews with older victims, and I also had the opportunity in the 90s to spend a fair amount of time visiting support groups for older survivors and talking to older victims throughout the state of Wisconsin and through the course of my career throughout the country. And one of the themes that I have heard over and over again is that for many older victims, they may not call law enforcement. They may not know what Adult Protective Services is or what they do. They may be reluctant to contact a domestic violence or a sexual assault program. They're more likely potentially to reach out to healthcare providers and faith leaders and members in their faith community. And knowing that a large number of older adults are engaged in their faith community, I was always drawn to this notion of we should be working more closely with faith leaders to give them the information and training so that they could work collaboratively with us. The second reason I felt like this was going to be a particularly important project for me is just my own faith engagement and life in my own faith community. And when I think about the crises in my own life and where I turn and how I make decisions and what values are important to me, my faith values have directed many of those decisions in my life. And so I can see the connection for older victims as they're thinking about safety planning and the choices that they're going to make, and how having conversations with faith leaders that include spiritual values into their decision-making process can be particularly crucial. And then finally, it was one older survivor who really gently and not so gently nudged me into this work. Back in the 90s when I was working in Wisconsin, I had a dear friend whose name was also Bonnie, and we had a deal. She would co-present with me at a variety of opportunities and trainings that we had and participate on our advisory committee if I, in turn, would actively seek out resources and champions to work on a faith project. Bonnie was abused by her husband for many years. He was a Lutheran pastor, and so much of what I know about this particular topic I've learned from Bonnie, from other survivors, and from my work with Anne Marie. So Anne Marie, what brought you to this work?
Well, I kind of come at it from the other side, Bonnie. I pastored for 6 years in Boston. I had a small congregation. Nothing remarkable at all about my congregation, really. It probably was remarkable that I came in with some background in domestic violence and sexual assault, so I had that lens. And yet, there were situations happening in my congregation that I just couldn't understand, and I certainly didn't know how to respond to them effectively. And looking back on it now, I have a huge mea culpa feeling that I should have responded better. One example is a woman in my congregation, I'll call her Mary, who was pretty much everyone's grandmother. Everyone loved her. She had been born into this congregation, baptized in this congregation, and when I got there, she was about 85 years old. She could no longer make it up the steps to our sanctuary, but everyone just went to her instead. She lived on her own in an apartment, and people visited her all the time. You know, she was really part of the congregation. Anyway, I went to see her after she fell in her apartment and broke her wrist. And I did the usual pastoral visit, visiting in the hospital, say a prayer, etc. It was only months later that I found out that she had not just fallen and broken her wrist. Her adult grandson had broken into her home. He had demanded drug money. I found out later this was not the first time he demanded drug money. She refused, and he pushed her down, and she broke her wrist falling. So it was really an adult-grandson situation. I had no idea how to respond to that. I didn't even hear this directly from Mary. I only heard it from the family, and I only heard it, they only knew this because he confessed to them. She definitely did not mention it to anyone. So there was that piece where I really just didn't know how to respond. I had no idea what resources there were. I was completely ignorant of community services at the time. And then there was another parishioner, I'll call her Teresa, whose husband was actually in a coma when I got there, but they'd been married for 60 years, and I knew her well. She was very central to the congregation. He passed away, and I went over to her home to do the usual pastoral visit to talk about the funeral and, make arrangements. And usually the family and friends are gathering around, and there's a lot of tears and a lot of laughter and kind of remembering the person who's passed away. That's what I was expecting. I knocked on the door, and my first sentence was going to be my condolences. And Teresa answered the door, and the first thing she said was, "Thank God that bastard's dead." And she told, for the first time ever to anyone, she told me about 60 years of unbelievable abuse that ended only with him being hospitalized in a coma. And so, again, here I was. I had no idea of community services or sort of what to do. And so when I then heard Bonnie talk about abuse in later life or elder abuse, a huge light bulb went on over my head. And I was immediately charged up to figure out how to make the connection and learn more and stand at this intersection. So we're also interested in who else is here with us in this room, and we know that many of us wear many hats, but we're wondering if you'd be willing to identify yourself on this poll. The good news about the poll is you don't have to just be one. You can choose more than one, but we'd just really like to know how you kind of come at this work. We know that this is a very complex situation typically, and abuse in later life is very complex, so it requires kind of a multidisciplinary, multi-perspective solution, and so we're really happy to have as many people as possible in the room. We believe that everyone has a role to play, a very unique and important role to play. So we'd love to know who you are. We'll give you just a minute to fill that in. So I think that gives everybody enough time to check all the boxes they'd like to check. So I'll end the poll, and just to say again how glad we are that each and every one of you are here, because we really believe that that all of us have a really unique and important role to play. So thank you so much for that. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the role that each of you can take on with this. We'll learn more about that as we go here. So Bonnie, I want to start with a question for you. And I'm speaking with my faith leader hat on, and I'm picturing myself at my desk in my congregation. And I have a lot of work to do here. It's a lot of work to run my congregation. I'm incredibly busy. I'm stretched really thin. I have a lot of different ministries going on, a lot of issues on my plate, and my congregation is very busy. And I'm just wondering, I'm not looking to add more things to do here, so I'm wondering why should I be concerned about abuse of older adults if I'm leading a local congregation?
It's such a great question, Anne Marie. So I'm going to start by talking very briefly about sort of the numbers and the research and the personal connections, just sort of the briefest of overviews on this issue. And for me, one of the most compelling reasons that I think faith leaders and victim service providers who may work more with a younger population than an older population want to be thinking about this issue is that 10,000 Americans are turning 65 every day for the next 16 years. This is a population that's growing, and it's a population that is growing in terms of its diversity. We're seeing significant percentages of people from various racial and ethnic groups growing as well, so that we want to think about the work that we do to be culturally competent and really considering the needs of a very, very diverse population. And certainly taking into account those of us who do violence against women work, that this is violence against women work given the higher percentage of older women that are in the population as we age. We, in the elder abuse field, are still significantly behind domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse in terms of what we know from the research, but a couple of studies that have been done where other smaller studies have replicated similar findings gives us a bit of an idea about how much abuse is out there in later life. And one study that was done a few years ago where they found that 1 in 10 of older adults who were living in the community reported that they had been abused. This study involved contacting about 6,000 older adults by phone and asking them a series of questions, including some questions about abuse. And as I said, 1 in 10 reported some kind of abuse, neglect, or exploitation in the previous year. And I want you to think a moment about this particular study. These were folks that had the financial resources to have a telephone. They had the physical ability to get up from wherever they were and get to the telephone and answer it before the researcher hung up. They had the cognitive ability, meaning that they did not have dementia or other cognitive limitations that made it difficult for them to communicate and answer the questions. They were cognitively aware enough to be able to answer all of the questions. And none of the participants in this study lived in a facility such as a nursing home or assisted living. And what we know and understand about abuse suggests that those that are the most vulnerable are in fact at most risk of being abused, neglected, or exploited, so that those living in facilities may be at higher risk. This 1 in 10 number, while shocking to me, I think is still low. We also, as you can note on the slide, have noted that about 47% of older adults with dementia may be being abused, and this is based on reports by caregivers of abusers when asked a series of questions. A number of studies have found about in this range of about half, and this number is particularly important because for persons age 80 and older, about half of those people may have some form of dementia or Alzheimer's disease. So the numbers are staggering, and yet we are not seeing nearly as many cases as are out there that are coming to light in any of our systems, whether it's Adult Protective Services, Law Enforcement Victim Services, or others. A study that was done across the state of New York found that for every one case of abuse that comes to the attention of some kind of law enforcement, Adult Protective Service, or other agency, there are another 23 cases that never come to light. And if it's a case of financial exploitation, the numbers are even more staggering, that only 1 in 47 cases are being addressed by professionals who might be able to provide care and support and resources. In addition to the numbers, I think we also just want to think about the moral issues involved here and the personal connections that each of us have. So depending on how old you are, you might be thinking of grandparents, you might be thinking of older parents, you might be thinking of peers such as siblings, friends, neighbors, older adults that you know through your community or within your faith community. This is a population that has really built the society that we all live in today. They deserve to live in dignity and respect. And finally, I think it's just really important for us to be thinking about this issue not only for those that we love and care about and care for, but as we are all aging, I think we want to be considering what are the kinds of services that we'd like to see out there for ourselves and for those that we love. So Anne-Marie, it was a great question that you asked me, and I'm going to flip it back to you and ask you a similar question. For local advocates who are working in shelters or other victim service providers or people on the front lines who are working with older victims every day, they are being asked to do a tremendous amount of work, not only to provide support and care and resources and referrals for older victims, but because these cases are so complicated, they are working with a number of other systems and service providers, the criminal and civil justice system. They may be connecting with people in healthcare or the Aging Services Network or Adult Protective Services. It's hard to think about taking on building relationships with faith leaders and the faith community. Can you talk to us about why you think that faith, working with the faith community is so important, and where the challenges might be, and where doing work at this intersection can really bring some additional resources and support?
I'd be happy to. The first thing to know about older adults, many of you will know this already, is that depending on their age group, something between 85 and 89% of older adults are faith affiliated. So it's really, really important to older adults that we take their faith into account. For these older adults, faith can be a source of strength and courage and connection, but also it can be misinterpreted to support abuse, and both of these things are happening at the same time. So I'd say for advocates going into this, knowing that it's a bit of a two-edged sword at times, and it's really important to make sure that faith for older adults is as much a resource as possible and as little a barrier to safety as possible. So let me just talk a little bit more about what that might look like. I'm going to talk with the bad news first, and sort of faith as a barrier. Unfortunately, most faith leaders have not learned about abuse in later life when they were in seminary or rabbinic school or whatever schooling they got to become faith leaders. Most of us just don't know much about this, and so we have responded in ways that have not necessarily been helpful in the past. This is a quote from one of the victims that I spoke with when I worked at a shelter here in Massachusetts. And it speaks for itself. The pain of this, the pain of not being supported by your faith community when you have been part of that faith community all your life is it's palpable. This is from another survivor who was clearly shut down by her faith community when she turned to them for help. And again, another survivor, speaking from a Christian point of view. This is from the Institute on Domestic Violence in the African American Community, which is another TA provider nationally. And they did studies in 12 cities. This is not pointedly about elder abuse, but about abuse in general, domestic violence. And it mentioned that one of the biggest reasons for not seeking help for families that were experiencing abuse had to do with just sort of the denial and silence within the faith community or from the faith leader, it's him or herself. So it's a really important nexus for how victims get help. So here's where we are when faith leaders haven't received training and resources. And you heard me say earlier that I was honored to teach about this at a seminary here in the Boston area recently. We really do believe that that's one of the few times nationally that has happened, that elder abuse has been part of a seminary curriculum at all. So here's where we are without that kind of training and resources. And by we, I mean faith leaders. We are often in denial that this is happening or that it's happening in our own congregations. And there's a sort of the silencing that happens as well. And I think part of that has to do with how much we have on our plates and, not wanting to take on maybe another big issue that we don't quite know how to respond to. There's also a lot of blaming and judging. This has gone on for generations, but the sense of, what did you do to make someone do that to you kind of questions. The judging, like, I would never let this happen to me. I've heard all of this from faith leaders and from people in faith communities. In addition, I would add to the list this minimizing and sanitizing. And those of you who are advocates know that survivors are typically going to minimize what's happening to them. And you know that, and you know how to read between the lines a bit when you're speaking with survivors. Faith leaders haven't got that training. In addition, we've realized that something else is happening. We've coined the word sanitizing to describe this. Most people who are experiencing abuse of some kind don't talk in the ugly language that describes abuse or describes what a victim is hearing. We don't talk in that ugly language typically to our faith leaders or in sacred space. So I believe that victims and survivors are coding what they're saying. And so they might say to an advocate the very brutal language that they're hearing at home, for example, whereas to a faith leader they might say, well, so-and-so is not very nice to me. So we're missing it. We as faith leaders are missing it on a couple of levels there. We're hearing the minimized version, taking it at face value. We're also hearing a very sanitized version. And then as faith leaders, people do turn to us for solutions, and so we're often the ones who jump in with a quick solution. If we don't have the broader picture of how deep-seated and dangerous this can be, we sometimes come in with unsafe solutions. We're also easily manipulated by people who abuse. I had one faith leader say to me, we're suckers for a good confession. We're often taken in by an abuser. We don't appreciate the depth of this, and so we think that a confession or a tearful confession may change behavior going forward. And although it would be a good step, as we all know, it's not going to change behavior going forward, and so it's a very dangerous thing to get sort of manipulated into that. And yet faith leaders are prone to do that. The other thing I would say is that when I did come through seminary, and this is true of many other faith leaders, seminary, rabbinic school, et cetera, we are given a tool, and that is couples and marriage counseling, family counseling. My dad always says, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So we use that one tool, even though it's dangerous in situations where there might be abuse happening. And so family counseling is not going to be helpful in the situation of abuse in later life, but it may be the only tool I have, and so it may be that where I turn to try to provide help. And the final thing I would say is, I think faith leaders are often dead ends because we don't know how to refer out to the community. And so this has been the picture in the past. Our job is to change this picture, and we're working very hard to do that. So my job, my sort of mission in life, and the mission of my agency and my work with Bonnie and National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life has been to figure out how to make faith more of a resource for folks, and how we can be part of the solution. So one thing to know, I mentioned already how common religious affiliation is for older adults. The American Psychological Association tells us that they're seeing 50% of older adults reporting that they attend some sort of religious service weekly. So this means older adults are in our congregations, are participating in organized religion. So it's an amazing opportunity to provide education and some resources. So the other reason I think for doing this, Bonnie, is just what we hear from survivors themselves, how important that spiritual suffering is, and that abuse doesn't just affect you physically or mentally, but also spiritually. And they speak very powerfully and movingly about the importance of the spiritual suffering that this victim was eloquent in describing. In addition, I would say that faith is a tremendous resource for faith-affiliated older adults. The spiritual connection is critical to their identity, their decision-making, their healing, and the way that they see the options that are available to them as they move forward. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Religion, the word, comes from the Latin word religare, which is, it's the same root as the word ligament. And it means to connect and to bind and to, make connections, to connect things. So some of the things that religion or spirituality or faith, I'm going to use those words sort of very broadly, cast the net very broad. It doesn't have to be an organized religious tradition, and you don't even really have to be terribly observant. But these are some of the things that religion or spirituality or faith can connect older victims and survivors to. It's everything from their community and their traditions to whomever they see as a creator or higher power or God or spirit. So it's everything in between, the history, their country of origin, their culture, maybe a language that they haven't spoken for many years, or memories. All of these are connected often through our spirituality. In addition, faith is a resource that survivors can carry with them, no matter what happens to them, no matter where they go. And as we all know, abuse can lead to many losses in the lives of victims and survivors. So religion or faith or spirituality is one of the ways that people can grieve those losses and figure out how to move forward. So it's important for that as well. And then, as you all know, abuse is crazy-making. It's completely crazy-making. It just, makes you feel like you don't have your feet on the ground half the time and don't know which end is up. Religion or spirituality or faith are one of the ways that people have structure in their lives that can help them reorient. So whether you are facing a particular direction to pray 5 times a day, or maybe you're worshiping in a space that faces a particular direction, or whether you're orienting yourself in time because of liturgical seasons, or whether it's just a way that you stay centered in your values and your identity, religion can be a real resource for victims to stay connected to who they are in the midst of the losses and crazy-making that is abuse. So in addition, another reason for reaching out to faith community members and leaders, and why I think we hold an important key, not the only key, but an important key to this, is that we're so perfectly located socially. We know these older victims and members of our community. We know them. We've been in their homes. We've gone through other crises with them. We've visited them. We often know their families across generations, and we know their extended families. And as you saw in the situation with Mary, we visit in hospitals, we visit in long-term care facilities and nursing homes. We're there. We sometimes volunteer even to provide services in nursing homes and other facilities. We visit folks in their homes, which can be an amazing way to learn more about what's happening in people's lives. And we're also trusted confidants, and that's really, really important. Research is showing that older adults overwhelmingly say that they would turn to faith leaders with a problem like abuse. And that number goes even higher when you're talking about victims and survivors from communities, racial and ethnic and religious minority communities, especially where faith is really vibrant and central to people's lives. So for those reasons, I think it's really important to think about doing some outreach with faith leaders. I think we can be we're potentially a huge resource. I appreciate that we haven't been there always, but we, I think, are ready to move to that place.
So I'm going to just interrupt for 1 minute. This is Ann, and I'm just going to remind our speakers that we have somebody who's closed captioning the webinar, so not to speak too fast.
Thank you, Ann. It's a great reminder. It's always a great reminder for me because I get so excited about this content. It's good to remember to slow down and breathe as we're going through this. Anne-Marie, is there anything else you wanted to add about faith community members and leaders before I share sort of the flip side of the conversation that you just had on the previous slide about some of the great reasons victim service providers should be working with the faith community?
Well, I guess I would say that I truly believe that anyone in a faith community can be a first responder. And so when we reach out, we typically reach out to faith leaders and invite them to bring their parishioners, their congregants, the members of their community into the conversation as well. Because a survivor might decide to reach out to her faith leader or his faith leader, but the survivor may also turn to someone who's sitting next to them in a scripture study or sitting next to them in a men's group or a women's group or something like that. So in a way, I think we all need to be brought up to speed, and so I'm looking for opportunities to do that.
Yeah, I think that is such a great point to make. And so, as you mentioned, when we started our work together, when did you say we did that? 2006, 2008?
I think it was 2008.
2008. It's been an incredible journey to be having conversation with you and then others as we have brought other folks from various faith and spirituality backgrounds to the table and attended a support group for older survivors to give us some input into the products and to the guidance of this project. I think what you just said has been one of the crucial messages that we have learned along the way, that faith leaders and members in faith communities have a particular and unique role, and again may be a much more likely place for older victims to turn than picking up the phone and calling a domestic violence program. But everything that you just said about
It looks like Bonnie may have just gotten disconnected.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
This is Anne-Marie.
I'll text her.
Okay. Meantime, I could say also that I think faith leaders, we like to have them think in terms of three things. First of all, and we'll get to this a little bit in the webinar, but we'd like to have them think about what their role is in terms of intervening with individuals who turn to them for help, or even recognizing red flags and maybe asking some questions and trying to connect people to resources. So there's the intervention piece. But we also feel that faith leaders have a tremendous potential to provide education as sort of prevention and education within their congregations. If I think, for example, about my congregation's building and I think this is true of many other congregations' facilities. It wasn't just my congregation who used it. There was a daycare, there was scouts, there was an exercise group, there was a food pantry, there were lots of things going on in the congregation. So when I put out resources, those resources are readily available to the community, and the community also picks those up in a faith context, thinking, okay, the faith community trusts this community resource, so I probably can as well. And then we also ask faith leaders to think about the long-term social change that's needed to bring an end to this. So maybe how could we talk about ageism, for example? How can we talk about that as one of the justice issues that we need to be thinking about? And how can we think about sort of approaching those issues, talking about them in a way that would help us all move past a place where older adults are abused in our communities. So really the sort of prophetic voice that I have as a faith leader can be used to make a change on the bigger level in terms of how we think about elder abuse and abuse in later life. So I would add that as well. We also really support what we call supported referrals. So, for example, someone might not pick up a phone and just call a hotline or call the police, but someone might be more willing to call an advocate if I, as that person's faith leader, say, oh, you know what, I just met Bonnie, and she's really, really nice, and she provides these services, and they might be helpful to you, and maybe it's something we could think about, and I'm happy to go there with you or help you call or any of that. I think it's a much different referral. And where faith communities tend to be very relational, it's a way of saying, I trust this person, and so you can as well. So really it's meaning that a faith community member can be a bridge to services in the community for folks who otherwise may not reach out for help.
So Anne-Marie, I am back.
Oh, good.
I've done many webinars, and that is the first time that my line is completely disconnected in mid-sentence, and I've gone to dial tone. So I apologize for dropping off, and I've loved coming back and listening, knowing that you could just go forward without me. But I did want you to know that that I have returned, and I do not know why I disappeared.
Well, I'm sure that your blood pressure went up a bit, so take a deep breath.
I was going to say probably not more than yours, though. So do you want me to do a little bit of summary of this slide and then move on?
Yeah, I think so. Just maybe because I just was speaking about the role that faith leaders can play a little bit and the importance of how they can support survivors. But one of the things that I'll say to everyone on this webinar is I really do not want faith leaders to do this by themselves at all. And I think that can be a little dangerous. So we are always looking to build bridges between faith communities and community services. And so the role of victim service providers and advocates is really, really important. I truly believe that faith leaders cannot take up this role or this issue unless they have built very good relationships with their community service providers. So I'll let you go. Take it from there, Bonnie, but just so important, the bridge.
Yeah, I would totally agree from the victim service provider end. I think there is a lot that we can learn from faith leaders and faith communities that will help us think through options that may be available or not available to a victim based on her values. So to sit with a victim and do some safety planning and come in listening to victims with a very victim-centered approach, which is how we do our work as victim service providers and advocates, it is important, I think, to understand that there may be some choices that simply are not going to be on the table for some victims based on their cultural background and their faith background. And it's why this working collaboratively is so important. And I do think that what is crucial for faith leaders to know about the framework that victim service providers use is that we listen to victims and meet them where they're at, that they are the ones telling us what's important in their lives and what choices they're going to make. Coming to a domestic violence program does not mean that you'll get advice about leaving a situation unless that's what the victim chooses to do. We work with victims who choose to stay in long-term marriages, short-term marriages, want to continue to have contact with people who are harming them. That might be adult children, caregivers, or other family members. And sometimes I think to people in the community, including in the faith community, it can be a little frustrating sending someone to services and hoping that getting help is going to be the definition of help by the person making the referral. And oftentimes that our hope is that that person will be safer and that safety comes from leaving. And I think it really is just crucial to understand that advocates meet victims where they're at, provide information and referrals and connections into communities.
And I would add to that that faith leaders, when we do train faith leaders, we say very forthrightly that none of us who are faith leaders are ever going to be necessarily experts on abuse in later life at all. And so we're so relying on those faith leaders. But also how we define success, which is just what you've said. Did I listen? Did I respond compassionately? Did I respond to the spiritual issues? Did I refer, rather than did the victim do what I wanted them to do, which is not so helpful. So we talk about that as well. Yeah. Not all survivors. We're talking here as all survivors, all older survivors are faith-based, but in fact, there's going to be some who are not, who are perhaps not faith-affiliated to begin with, or who have been really re-traumatized by their faith leaders when they reached out. So I really want to recognize that. There's a whole community of people who are not faith-affiliated or who have not been affirmed and heard. But I would suggest that even with that everyone deserves to be heard and affirmed, and needs someone to really sort of bear witness to what's happened and to kind of accompany them on this journey. It's a journey with safety and justice and healing kind of at the end point, but it's a very difficult journey. And so I would argue that everyone, whether it's an advocate, whether it's a faith leader, whether it's a friend or a family member, everyone deserves to be heard and to be accompanied on this. It's a difficult journey and not something that anyone should have to take on their own.
And I think our message has been clear throughout this webinar that working together is crucial. These cases are complicated. As Anne-Marie just said, they're difficult, complex choices, sometimes not as many options available to victims as they would hope. And those of us that are trying to help them navigate through complicated systems often find that working together collaboratively can really make a difference, both on the micro level, if you're working as part of a multidisciplinary team, or more on a macro level with a coordinated community response addressing potential systems change. So these are just some of the players that might be involved in the life of an older victim. I think it's important for faith communities to recognize that some older victims may be in communication with professionals from a number of systems and sometimes may be getting conflicting messages. And it's important, I think, for each of us to know what the other roles and responsibilities for the various systems are, and to stay in our roles and work together as best we can. So Anne-Marie, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of the roles and some specific things that faith leaders can offer?
Yes, I started to mention some of this before, and I think I'll preface this by saying that I think one important piece for faith leaders to keep in mind is that whether we want to be in this role or not, that we're often gatekeepers to other services as well. I think many times survivors turn to us for almost permission to reach out for help. They may be tripping up on issues like forgiveness or what moral duty they have to their family members, or to other people in the community who may be harming them. And so I think there's an important role there as well, or it's important to keep in mind how often survivors struggle between safety and faith, and we really need to make sure that they can be both at the same time, safe and faithful. So within that, I would say that faith leaders are in a really good place to listen, to maintain confidentiality and support safety, but just listen to what's happening. We know that the first step for healing for survivors is often just feeling as though someone has heard what's happening and has affirmed that and affirmed that the survivor didn't deserve what happened. So there's that too, the acknowledgement of the abuse and the trauma and the effect that that has on someone's life, and particularly on the effect it has on someone's spiritual journey, to acknowledge that. We know from research that oftentimes older survivors have experienced layers of trauma, and so being able to look at that, sort of the lifespan journey and acknowledge what this person has been through. And then also just the assurance that the person who turns to us is not to blame for this. Oftentimes, as you know, survivors are blaming themselves. They've heard that from whoever is abusing them often, and it's important to not reinforce that blame. And then, as I said, survivors come with many theological and spiritual questions, scriptural questions often. It's important to think now for faith leaders, to have the opportunity to think now about how they would respond to that. How you would talk about forgiveness in the context of abuse, how you would talk about long-term relationships or relationships with family members and so forth, and just really have that those tools at the ready even before someone comes to you for crisis, and to provide the theological and spiritual and emotional support that folks are reaching out to their faith community for. And that can go on over a long period of time at the same time that we are making community referrals and providing some material support as well. And I would say that those community referrals, I've said this before, are critically important. Supported referrals where I'm making it very clear that I trust whomever I'm referring the survivor to is important. For some survivors, it might be important that I could take them there perhaps, or help them make that connection. And so that gives you a sense of where I think faith community leaders and faith community members can plug in.
And for those faith leaders who are referring to victim service providers, we wanted to just briefly highlight some of the things that most victim service providers across the country do. Each local program has its own programming and activities that it engages in. It's really important to ask on the local level what's available through a domestic violence or a sexual assault program. But in general, I think faith leaders can expect that a victim would get some information about the dynamics of abuse, some support, some counseling, an opportunity to engage in safety planning, to really talk about what that victim wants to do and have happen next, and then to consider ways to remain safe and to break isolation. Domestic violence and sexual assault programs often engage in legal advocacy, economic advocacy, and work with other systems to help navigate the complex paperwork and steps that are often involved in being part of the criminal justice system or in trying to get some additional financial resources. And finally, for those in need, there's emergency shelter and or transitional housing available potentially as well. This list is much longer in some communities, so again, check in your local communities about what programs offer. And Anne-Marie, I feel like this is the message that you've given all along, but it's a nice summary here.
Well, it's really our mantra. If you picture us in yoga position, this is really our mantra: refer, refer, refer. We don't want faith leaders doing this on their own at all. We really, really need the support of our service providers around us. So to the extent that service providers and advocates can reach out to faith leaders and build those bridges, I think the better. The only other thing I would say about referring is I really encourage faith leaders to try not to be dead ends, because I think victims often experience sort of shifting sand where things are changing daily or minutely sometimes and hourly. And so one of the things that I usually say to a survivor is, I'm going to support your decision now, whatever it is, and if you change your mind tomorrow, I will support that decision as well. If this referral doesn't work, come back to me and we'll try to find something that does work. Just try to always keep that door open. So it's refer, refer, refer. It's not a one-shot deal. It's hang in there and really try to help the person get to services that work.
Yeah, great message. So we are coming near the end of our hour. If you have questions that you would like Anne-Marie or I to answer before we close out, please put them in the chat room. Ann Turner will collect those. And with a couple minutes that we'll have after we highlight a few resources, we will attempt to answer a few of those questions. So the first resource I want to make you available of, if you're not familiar with the Office on Violence Against Women Abuse in Later Life program, the request for proposals will likely be coming out sometime within the next couple of months, so please go to the Office on Violence Against Women website for more information. This program is a program that local communities or states can apply for money. It's generally about $400,000 a year over a 3-year grant period, and those funds can be used, are required to be used for training for law enforcement, for prosecutors, for judges, for victim service providers. The curricula for all of those trainings have been developed, and there are some training of trainer events and some national institutes to help provide training to everyone or to a number of different disciplines within a local community so that people have a common language and understanding of the issue. And from there, those professionals come together and either create or enhance a coordinated community response team to focus on systemic change on the macro level, and a quarter of the funding is used for services for older victims. It's a very small grant program through the Office on Violence Against Women, so only about 9 communities are funded a year. And if you need technical assistance as you are thinking about, if you're thinking about applying and want more information, please contact the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life. As you can see on this map, we have had programs since 2006 in a number of states across the country. There are a handful that have not had any projects left. So if you live in one of those states, I would strongly encourage you to consider applying for funding. And again, this is a fabulous program that brings together victim services, training, and some coordination activities that can really make a significant impact for older victims within your community. And Anne-Marie, do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the resources that we've created before we move to questions?
Yes, and these are available on our website, so please, whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Please make sure you take a look at those. We have printed versions as well, and we can send them to you, or you can also download them for free in black and white or color from our website. So there's a couple of things. We put together a toolkit, and the complete toolkit is for service providers on the left-hand side and faith leaders on the right-hand side. And for the service providers, we did things like a checklist to think about, what should I think about before I reach out to faith leaders? What are some of the things that I should be considering? And also, if I do visit one of my faith leaders, what should I think about before that visit as well? So you'll see those on the left-hand side of our toolkit or on our website. And then for faith leaders, as you've heard, I've been in a congregation. I know how little time I had. So we developed 3 things. One is a bookmark, and we have many of these. They're cheap to print, so we're happy to send them out. We're hoping that these bookmarks will kind of get around in congregations and will be put in people's prayer books or scripture or liturgies or whatever it is, so that they're kind of around. And on the one side, they have resources, for more information, but also who to call if you're in trouble. And on the other side, just a little information about elder abuse to raise awareness for folks who are in the congregation and the community. We also put together a very short brochure for faith leaders and for anyone in a faith community that just talks about some of the red flags. Here's what to look out for. Here's what abuse in later life is and who might be an abuser. Kind of just an overview of what to look out for. We're hoping that folks will have another lens to look at situations when they are visiting in hospitals or homes or in the community. And then for folks who are maybe wanting to dive a little deeper, we put together a booklet that has a more in-depth information. We include a little bit on mandatory reporting for faith leaders and so forth. So that's there. We also have a partnership guide that we put together. I should have said that all of this is based on focus groups we did across the country with faith leaders and advocates and with victims and survivors. So we had a lot of great input. We also, once we had this toolkit put together, did a summit on abuse in later life and faith, where we brought together adult protective services, faith leaders, and advocates, and tried to sit down in a room and think about what are some of the barriers to working together and what are some of the ways we can get over those barriers. We put all that together in a partnership guide, which you can also access on our websites, or if you contact us, we're happy to send them to you printed. And the only other thing I want to say really quickly is that you'll see on our resources a watermark. And the watermark names things like compassion and safety and confidentiality. These are values that all three of our focus groups said that they bring to the table. So these are our common values and the place where we stand when we're working together, when we're looking to build those bridges. So, yeah.
Fabulous description of those. So it looks like we have a couple minutes left for questions. Anne, if you can give us one or two questions, and if we don't get to a question that you ask, you see our email addresses on the contact information. We love to hear from people with questions or comments or to hear what's going on in your community. So Anne?
Yeah, so I'm just going to try to summarize here a couple of questions. I think there are a lot of questions on how to get buy-in from the faith community, and also kind of as a second part of that one of the barriers is just that whole understanding of meeting the needs of victims and those perceptions about the victim. Especially from the faith community or even the service provider, kind of that focus on what's wrong with the victim rather than that more holistic report, or from that more holistic perspective. So if that makes any sense, so kind of how do you get buy-in, and then how do you get people all on the same page understanding that whole victim-centered response?
Okay. Well, I have 2 minutes to do that, right?
Yeah.
The first thing I'd say about buy-in is that we did put together an outreach guide, which you'll also see on our website, where we took some of the sort of distancing and whatnot that goes on that we have heard from faith leaders, and put that down, name it, and then talk about some of the strategies that we have used over time to try to capture faith leaders' attention and engagement on this. So that might be a resource. The other thing is that when we do have the opportunity to talk to faith leaders, we use some really useful videos as a way to help folks kind of understand where survivors are coming from. And those videos are available from the National Clearinghouse. One is called, help me out here, Bonnie, In Their Own Words, I believe. Is that right?
Yes.
It has vignettes of survivors talking about their own experiences. And I think for faith leaders who may not have heard from victims and survivors, who have not seen things from their perspective, those videos are really, really helpful for sort of building compassion. The other thing I would say is that Bonnie and I are currently in the middle of trying to put together a curriculum, and there'll be more news about that at a future date, but just to know that we are working on that, and that some of that curriculum is about building compassion and understanding from where survivors are coming from. So we're kind of working on that as well. So that responds a little bit to the compassion issue. I think some of that comes from hearing actual survivors, and I think some of it comes from training and resources.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, and I also think it's about building relationships, which is why we created the toolkit. I think how any of this work moves forward is finding allies and champions. It took me years to find Anne Marie. I had dropped a lot of hints. I had gone to a lot of meetings. I had looked for people that would be a champion to work with me on this issue, and it took time and work, but I can tell you based on the experience that I've had with our national work, by finding finding the right people who are interested, and there are a lot of people really interested in this topic. We've been able to teach each other, learn, and to grow from there. And so looking at the clock and knowing that we need to close it up here, I would thank all of you for participating in this webinar and your interest in this topic. Thank you for everything that you do for older survivors in your community, and I would strongly encourage you to start where you are and try to move forward, even if it's slowly, in relationship building. Final comments from you, Anne Marie?
Yes, I'm just thankful, so thankful for all of you who have been on this call. You're making me very hopeful, and I believe that it's going to take a lot of work, but I think we can do that work and build this movement where faith communities are speaking out against abuse of older adults and also being part of the solution. So, yeah, find those ally faith leaders and ask them to connect you to their colleagues, and we'll move forward from there.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you, Anne and Alicia, for all of your technical support today. Goodbye.
Yes, and thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you, Anne Marie, as well. Bye-bye.
Bye.